Okay, last time we were introducing some central notions of epistemology. We got up to knowledge. I'll now say a little bit more about knowledge. So I said last time that believing a proposition is a necessary condition for knowing it. It being true is a necessary condition for knowing it, and believing it justifiably is a necessary condition for knowing it. So why do I say that? Well, let's take belief. Suppose I say to you this: I know it's raining outside. And then you say, oh, so you're going to grab your umbrella? And I say, why would I do that? And you say, because you know it's raining outside. And I say, yeah, I know it's raining outside, but I don't believe it's raining outside, so why would I grab my umbrella? That's really strange. It looks like I've contradicted myself. Why? Because if you know something, then you believe it. Now, there are figurative uses of words like know and believe, where people will say, I know it, but I don't believe it. So, for example, somebody might say, I know Joe Biden won the election, but I just don't believe it. Or I know it's snowing outside in June, but I just don't believe it. What they mean in those cases is not that they literally know it and don't believe it. Instead, what they mean is they literally know it and figuratively don't believe it. So, for example, the person who says, I know Biden won, but I don't believe it, is typically saying, I know Biden won, I believe Biden won, but it's really hard for me to see how that happened. Or the person who says, I know it's snowing in June, but I don't believe it, is typically saying, I know it's snowing in June and therefore believe it's snowing in June, but it's really hard for me to see how that can happen. I thought that was very unlikely. So they aren't violating the rule that know implies believe. What about truth? Well, imagine the following. I say to you, look, I know that it's raining right now. And then you open the window and show me that it isn't raining. So it's false that it's raining. And you say, look, it's false that it's raining. And I say, yeah, but I still know it. Again, I've said something very odd. It looks like I've contradicted myself. If it's not raining, I might think I know it's raining, but I'm wrong. Knowledge requires that what you believe is true. That is, if it's not what you believe isn't true, then you don't really know it. You think you know it, but you don't. Knowledge requires truth. What about justification? Well, take a fanciful case. Imagine that I form the following belief. I believe that in Australia right now, there's someone who is saying exactly what I'm saying at the exact same moment, in the exact same way. And suppose that I form that belief because I think it would be really fun if it were true. Now, I have a belief, and it's held for a terrible reason. But suppose it happens to be true. Just by chance, there's someone saying exactly what I'm saying at the exact same moment in the exact same way. That wouldn't count as knowledge. Why wouldn't it count as knowledge? Because you can't luck into knowledge. When you form a belief for a bad reason and it happens to be true, it doesn't count as knowledge. Why not? Knowledge requires that you're not just lucky, but that you're good, that your belief is held for good reason, that it's justified. So belief, truth, and justification are necessary conditions for knowledge. Some people, historically, for a long time, thought they were sufficient conditions too. We'll talk later about a reason to think that they're not sufficient conditions and see what you make of it. But at the very least, they're intimately related to knowledge. Okay, now let's look at some implications of the distinctions that we just went through. If Jane believes P, then P is true. Is that right? So what we're going to do is go through a series of things and ask, are these implied by the definitions of knowledge, truth, justification, and belief that we just went through? So if Jane believes P, then P is true. Is that right? Well, no, it's not. And I should say there's an exercise where you're supposed to go through and do these things. And I'm now sort of explaining the answers to that exercise. So if you haven't done that exercise yet, you should go find it and do it. If you were in class, I would have just given it to you, and now we'd be coming to this slide. So if Jane believes P, then P is true. That's not right. Of course, if Jane believes P, Jane believes P is true. That's right. And that's trivial. But Jane believing P doesn't guarantee that P is true, at least not for every proposition. So suppose Jane believes it's raining. That doesn't guarantee it's raining. Jane can believe it's raining even when it isn't. Sadly, we can have false beliefs. What about this one? If P is true, then Jane believes P. Well, that's also false. Just because something's true doesn't mean you believe it. Sometimes there are true propositions and you know nothing about them. So, for example, there's a fact about, the charge of the particle that's exactly 10 meters from my nose. but I have no idea what it is. There's a truth. The charge is negative, the charge is positive, it's neutral. But I don't know what it is. Just because something's true doesn't mean you have any attitude towards it at all. So it doesn't mean you believe it. Moreover, even when something's true and you do have an attitude towards it, you might have the wrong attitude. So Jane might believe it's raining when it's not. So it's true that it's raining and Jane doesn't believe it. What about this one? If P is true, then Jane is justified in believing P. Well, that's trickier, and sometimes people are inclined to say, yeah, that's right, because if it's true, of course she has good reason to believe it's true. But notice this, even when a proposition is true, Jane might not have good reason to think it's true. So take the example I just gave. Suppose that the particle that's exactly 10 meters from my nose is negatively charged. Or, let's just say that, is negatively charged. It doesn't follow from the fact that that's true that I'm justified in believing that it's true, because I don't have good reason to believe it's true. So just because something's true doesn't mean you have good reason to believe it. What about this one? If Jane is justified in believing P, then P is true. Now, here the answer is fairly controversial. There are some people, they're called infallibilists. You don't need to know that label right now, but that's what they're called, who think that if you have good reason to believe something, then it must be true, because they think justification is reasons never amount to justification except when they guarantee the truth of what you believe. There's an alternative view, which is these days the dominant view, and I think the right view, which says you can have good reason to believe something, and because of bad luck, it can turn out to be false. So, for example, I might have good reason to believe that I don't have COVID. My reasons are that I rarely go out. When I do go out, I wear a mask. As far as I know, I've never interacted with anybody who has COVID. All pretty strong case that I don't have COVID, but then I can turn out to have COVID. So my belief was justified. I had good reason for it, but it turned out to be wrong. I'm going to say, I think that's wrong. You might disagree. You might say, look, if your reasons were really good enough, that would guarantee the truth of what you believe. Notice one consequence of that is this. If you adopt the view that justification guarantees truth, it implies that you're almost never justified in believing anything. So most of the time you think you have reasons for believing what you believe, including simple things like, you're in a classroom right now, or you're in front of your computer or whatever. Those beliefs come out as unjustified because your reasons for believing them don't guarantee their truth. How about this one? If Jane believes P, then Jane has justification to believe P. So this is saying if you believe something, then you have reason to believe it. Well, that's certainly not true. People believe all sorts of things without any reason at all. They believe things because someone told them, even if they know that person is unreliable, they still believe it. Well, that's not a good reason, yet they believe it. They believe things because of wishful thinking. They want it to be true. So, for example, you might believe lobsters don't feel pain because you want it to be true, because it makes it easier for you to eat them. Maybe lobsters don't feel pain, but you wanting to be able to eat them provides no reason to believe that they don't feel pain. So in that case, you would be forming a belief without good reason. And that happens all the time. How about this? If you have justification to believe a proposition, then you believe it. Well, that's also not true. Sometimes you have good reason to believe things, and yet you fail to believe them. A classic example in the literature of this is someone who has every reason to believe that his spouse or her spouse is cheating on him or her or them, and yet that person refuses to believe that the spouse is cheating because it's just too psychologically hard. So they have good reason, but they don't believe it. How about this one? If you know a proposition, then it's true. Well, that in fact is true. As we said before, if you know it, it must be true. Otherwise, you merely think you know it. And to illustrate this, just think of cases where someone says, look, I know it's raining outside. And then it turns out that it's not raining outside. What you say is, well, you thought you knew it was raining, but you didn't really know. If P is true, then you know P. Well, that's wrong because there's plenty of things that are true that you don't know. If you know P, then you believe P. Well, that's right, because if you know it, then you must believe it. Otherwise, you wouldn't know it. So it's, again, this is the example where you say, someone says, I know it's raining outside. And then you say, well, take your umbrella. And they say, why would I do that? I don't believe it's raining outside. They seem to have contradicted themselves. This one, if you believe P, then you know P. Again, that's false because you can have beliefs that aren't true. You can have beliefs that aren't justified, and therefore you can have beliefs that aren't knowledge. If you know P, then you have justification to believe P. Well, that's true because you can't luck into knowledge. If you know something, you must have reason to believe it. Otherwise, it doesn't really count as knowledge. If you have justification for believing something, then you know it. Well, that's false because you can have good reason to believe something and it can turn out to be wrong. Also, you can have good reason to believe something and it turns out you don't believe it. Okay, so beliefs can be justified or unjustified. They can be held for good reasons or not held for good reasons. Beliefs can be true or false. That is, they can affirm true propositions and they can affirm false propositions. Justified beliefs can be true or false. That is, beliefs held for good reason can be true, but beliefs held for good reason can be false. Here's an example of this, by the way. If you look at these chess pieces, the pieces on the top and the pieces on the bottom are pixel by pixel duplicates. That is, the pixel in this particular spot is the exact same white as the pixel in this particular spot. The pixel in this particular spot is the exact same black as the particular pixel in this particular spot, and so on for all of the pieces. The only thing that's different is the context, the surrounding color information. You can see this if you start to block out areas. No matter what area of a given piece you block out, you'll find that the pixels in that area are duplicates, and yet when you remove the boxing out, it looks like the bottom pieces are black and the top are white. If you saw this image, and you didn't know it was an illusion, I didn't say, hey, look, this is a trick, you would form the belief naturally and justifiably that the top pieces are white and the bottom pieces are black. But you'd be wrong. That would be a belief held for good reason that turned out to be false. Unjustified beliefs can be true or false. So, of course, a justified belief can be true, and we just looked and noted that a justified belief can also be false. Well, similarly, an unjustified belief can be true. You can luck into truth. It can happen. You believe something for a terrible reason, and it turns out to be true. So all of the evidence, to use the earlier example, suggests that your spouse is having an affair, but you refuse to form the belief because you don't want it to be true. Well, it can turn out that you're right. The evidence was misleading. Unjustified beliefs obviously can be false as well. Okay, well, given this, since justified beliefs can be false and unjustified beliefs can be true, you might wonder why you should care so much about justification, and the answer is straightforward. It's about probabilities. Beliefs that are justified are far more likely to be true than beliefs that are unjustified. And that's trivial because we define justification in terms of truth tracking. Okay. Typically, we think of justification as a central goal in epistemology. So when an epistemologist asks what Joe should believe, she is asking what Joe can believe with justification. When she asks whether Joe knows P, she's often asking whether Joe has justification for believing P. Accordingly, justification is a central notion, if not the central notion, of epistemology. And we're going to stop the intro to epistemology there, and next time we'll start looking at skepticism.